There are lies that fade like whispers, and others that bloom into poison. In the heart of Manhattan, an heiress walks into a brownstone carrying a secret that could shatter a fortune, and a murder that will test the boundaries of truth itself. Within those walls, intellect meets deceit, and every word may be a confession in disguise. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. It was one of those Manhattan afternoons when time decided to take a nap. I had the typewriter half loaded with paper I had no intention of feeding, and Fritz was in the kitchen humming what he claimed was Viennese, but sounded like indigestion set to music. Wolfe was upstairs with his orchids, which meant civilization below stairs was suspended until he decided the air was breathable again. Fritz wandered in, wiping his hands. "You will spoil your eyes staring at nothing," he announced. "Eyes like mine," I told him, "were built to stare at nothing in style." He chuckled, and I was about to demonstrate a new way of balancing my chair when the doorbell rang. The sound wasn't the usual firm ring that said business or police. It was the kind that apologizes for existing. I didn't have to be clairvoyant to know that ring was trouble in a decent coat. I slid out of the chair and headed for the door, muttering something unprintable about people who don't respect naps conducted in an upright position. She was standing on the stoop, tall, pale, dressed in wealth that didn't fit her mood. A fur-collared coat, gloved hands that trembled just enough to betray nerves, and eyes that had already seen something they wished they hadn't. "I'm looking for Mr. Nero Wolfe," she said. "You're lucky," I said. "Most people spend a lifetime trying to avoid him. Come in." Inside, the contrast between the brownstone's steady calm and her agitation was almost comic. She perched on the edge of the red leather chair as if the upholstery might judge her. "I am Margaret Vale," she said finally, as though the name should mean something. It did. The papers had been full of Lawrence Vale's estate the year before. Millions in trust, and one daughter to inherit them. I told her Mr. Wolfe was communing with his flowers and might require a bribe in the form of patience. She nodded but didn't really hear. Her hands twisted together like they were rehearsing for confession. I gave her the kind of silence that makes people feel it. She didn't, which was unusual and worrisome. When I went upstairs to the plant rooms, the smell hit first. Damp earth and Wolfe's special brand of sanctity. He was inspecting a pot the way a bishop inspects heresy. "Archie," he said without looking up, "unless the building is burning, I prefer solitude." "There's a woman downstairs," I told him. "Looks expensive. Sounds terrified. Name of Vale," he grunted. "Tell her to consult an attorney." "She mentioned your name. That, I fear, is a common vice." "Also," I said, leaning against the doorframe, "she looks like she might faint on the Persian rug." That did it. Wolfe sighed, put down his watering bulb, and lumbered toward the door like a man heading for unnecessary exercise. The heiress stood as he entered. Wolfe gave her the slow once-over he reserved for orchids and liars. "Miss Vale," he said, "you are younger than prudence and older than discretion. Sit down." She obeyed. I stayed standing. That's my usual position when lightning is expected. From her handbag, she drew an envelope. Cheap paper, cheap ink, and the faintest scent of panic. "This came yesterday," she said. "It says I must pay $5,000, or something about my family will be exposed." Wolfe reached out a hand the size of a catcher's mitt. "Expose it here." She passed it over. The handwriting was uneven, deliberate. Wolfe sniffed. "Blackmail," he pronounced, "is the coward's commerce." She nodded miserably. "It says my inheritance is illegitimate, that my father deceived the courts." Wolfe's brows lifted 1/8 of an inch. Mine went higher. Lawrence Vale had been the kind of man whose honesty could have been framed in the stock exchange lobby. "I cannot endure scandal," she said. "Will you help me?" Wolfe leaned back, fingertips together. "I will not. You mistake me for a moral laundress." That earned him a glance from me. He continued, silky as ever. "Blackmail, Miss Vale, feeds upon weakness. Pay it or confess, but do not importune me to patch your ethics." She flushed. "Then you refuse?" Emphatically. But while he talked, I caught something beneath his eyelids, the faint spark that meant he was interested. He could call it distaste for disorder all he wanted, but the man loved a puzzle the way Fritz loved butter. When she had gone quiet, Wolfe turned to me. "Archie, note that emotional disarray is contagious. You will sanitize the atmosphere by opening a window." I obeyed, but my mind wasn't on ventilation. The girl's story didn't hang straight, and if Wolfe hadn't smelled bait, I certainly had. While he closed his eyes, possibly to dream of moral geometry, I studied Miss Vale. The tremor in her hands wasn't fear alone, it was guilt looking for a hiding place. I'd seen it too often in witnesses and women. Then she said something that broke Wolfe's trance. The blackmailer mentioned a place called the Orchid Room Club. He said my father once went there, and that I should understand why. Wolfe's eyelids flicked open. "Repeat that." "The Orchid Room Club." He sat forward, the full tonnage of him awake. I knew that name. A gambling joint disguised as a supper club, long defunct, but remembered for one case Wolfe never discussed. "Ah," Wolfe murmured. "So the weed has roots." He turned to me. "You will obtain Miss Vale's particulars. We shall undertake the matter." Just like that, indifference dissolved into command. He dictated a fee that would have financed a small revolution. Miss Vale signed without flinching, which told me fear was cheaper to her than money. When the pen left her hand, Wolfe gave a curt nod, meaning the world could resume spinning. As she rose, I noticed her perfume. Faint, elegant, and already halfway out the door before she was. Wolfe was watching her with the still look of a man cataloguing motives. When the door closed behind her, I said, "You sure you're not letting sentiment leak into business?" Wolfe snorted. "Faugh! Sentiment is the refuge of lazy reason. The woman's predicament, however, has structure." He settled back, already retreating into thought. I knew better than to disturb him. I turned toward the window, where the city blinked in late-day gold, and thought about lies. How they trail perfume for a while before they start to stink. Downstairs, the house was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet. Wolfe was thinking 3 moves ahead, and when he thought, Manhattan tended to tremble a little. The night air outside the brownstone was the kind that made a man feel overdressed in his own skin. Wolfe had decided that since the bait has been dangled, someone had to go sniff it. That someone, of course, was me. He doesn't so much assign jobs as bestow them, like a reluctant god parceling out thunderbolts. The Orchid Room hadn't changed since the last time I'd had reason to visit. Smoke thick enough to butter, waiters with smiles rented by the hour, and a house band that thought volume was a substitute for talent. I ordered a ginger ale and tried not to look like a man on a job. The air was heavy with perfume, liquor, and a kind of decay money can't quite hide. Wolfe's instincts had been right. Deceit came with table service here. The place was crawling with men who looked like they belonged to money, and women who looked like they had survived it. The laughter was too bright, the conversation too rehearsed. I scanned faces with the usual patience, letting the night's rhythm push me into the background. Every so often, a new arrival drifted in through the haze, all pearls, powder, and nerves. If blackmail had a clientele, this was its country club. I was halfway through my drink when she appeared. Leona Farr, the kind of woman who didn't enter a room so much as stake a claim on it. Her eyes were sharp, her dress sharp enough to cut, and the smile she gave me had been used too many times to mean anything. "You're Miss Vale's errand boy," she said. Not asked. Said. "That depends who's asking," I told her. "And what for?" She laughed, not quite pleasantly. I know her kind. Heiresses with trembling hands and secrets worth more than diamonds. Sounds like you've been doing a study. "I've been doing something," she said, eyes flicking toward a private corner booth. "You should tell her. Money won't fix what's broken." Before I could press her, the band shifted to something loud enough to drown out subtlety. She leaned closer, and the scent of her perfume carried a hint of something sharp beneath the sweetness. "Tell Miss Vale," she whispered, "that it's not about her fortune. It's about who she really is." Then she was gone, a swirl of silk disappearing into the crowd before I could blink. That clue rattled around in my head as I left the club. The street outside was thick with fog, the kind that makes the world look like it's waiting to forget something. I crossed to the corner, lit a cigarette, and that's when I noticed him. A shadow about half a block back, matching my pace. He wasn't a drunk or a panhandler. This was a professional job, quiet and deliberate. I slowed at a newsstand, checked a reflection in the glass, and when I turned, the tail had vanished. Not a sound, not a step. Manhattan had swallowed him whole. Back at the brownstone, I'd barely kicked off my shoes when the phone rang. It was the police bulletin line, a service Wolfe kept under protest but used like oxygen. The voice at the other end was all business. "Woman found dead at the Orleans apartments. Name's Leona Farr. Poisoned. Looks like something exotic." "Exotic," I repeated. "That's one way to describe her." By dawn, the brownstone smelled of coffee and outrage. Inspector Kramer was in the office, doing his best to fill it with both. "Your boss stirred the pot again, Goodwin," he barked. "The Farr woman's dead. Poison, and her name was on one of Wolfe's little lists last year." "Wolfe's lists are private property," I said, "like his waistline." Kramer ignored me, which is his way of saying he's listening. Then Wolfe entered, draped in his yellow dressing gown like a disgruntled emperor. He gave Kramer one glance and sighed. "If the city's police force requires me to supply its hypotheses, I suggest the commissioner allocate part of my fee to your department's budget." "Don't get fancy," Kramer snapped. "You poked into a case, and now we've got a body." Wolfe's tone turned silkier. "Nonsense. Murder, Inspector, is not contagious." The two of them went at it like heavyweight philosophers. Kramer accused, Wolfe dissected. Between them, logic and law circled each other like cats sharing a mouse. I sat back and let it run. I've learned that when Wolfe gets angry, words turn into instruments, and when Kramer gets angry, they turn into ammunition. The combination's always entertaining. Kramer leaned across the desk. "You're hiding something. Don't tell me you didn't know that woman." "I do not know her," Wolfe said coldly, "though I am now acquainted with her corpse. As are you." Kramer's face went red, enough to roast marshmallows. "You're going to hang this on me, are you?" Wolfe continued, voice dropping to that low, dangerous calm. "Archie, note that the inspector's theory requires omnipotence. I have never found omnipotence compatible with appetite." I would have applauded, but Kramer looked ready to explode. Instead, I leaned back, thinking what a picture it was. Wolfe, half-shaven and regal. Kramer, red-faced and indignant. And somewhere uptown, a dead woman who had hinted at a secret that could rip our client's life wide open. The argument reached its final round when Wolfe straightened in his chair. "Inspector," he said, "I detest coincidence. It is an insult to intellect. If Miss Farr's death relates to Miss Vale's inheritance, I shall determine how. If it does not, you may have the glory of proving me wrong." Kramer muttered something unfit for stenography and stomped out. Wolfe rang for beer, signalling the end of the session and the start of thought. "Archie," he said finally as I poured, "fetch the file on the Orchid Room Club. Miss Vale's secret, it seems, has acquired a corpse." He lifted his glass and studied the amber surface. "A pity," he murmured. "But truth, once baited, seldom leaves the hook unbitten." That, in Wolfe's vocabulary, meant the case was no longer theoretical. It was personal. And I, as usual, was going to be the one doing the legwork to prove it. The drawer in the late Lawrence Vale's desk had all the right manners of a gentleman's secret, locked, dusty, and faintly perfumed with the kind of authority only old money can accumulate. It was the last drawer I tried, and naturally, it was the one that mattered. A few words from a locksmith I keep on friendly terms, and the mystery of the Vale family began to breathe again. Inside was a packet of letters tied with blue silk ribbon, the kind that expects violins to play while being opened. The handwriting was delicate, from a woman who signed herself Ellen Vale, Margaret's mother. At first glance, it was the usual sentimental paper trail: nursery chatter, childhood illnesses, the father's business triumphs. Then came a tone that didn't fit. One letter, dated nearly 30 years back, ended abruptly. "The doctor says she will not recover. Our little Margaret." The rest was torn away. The next envelope, written months later, spoke only of legal affairs, guardianship, and an arrangement to preserve the name. I sat there with the letters spread before me, thinking about the girl who had come to Wolfe's office swearing her inheritance was threatened. If this was the real Vale family's history, the heiress upstairs in the Ritz was borrowing more than a fortune. Wolfe didn't look up when I laid the packet before him in the office. He merely shifted the beer bottle from his right hand to his left and began reading, line by patient line, his lips barely moving. After 15 minutes, he leaned back, eyes half closed, which for Wolfe means his brain has started to boil. "So," he said at last, "our client is not only an heiress of dubious virtue, but perhaps not an heiress at all. Interesting." "Interesting," I said, "is one word. Fraud, perjury, and family ghost stories are others." He gave me a glare fit for a guilty monk. "Spare me your vernacular exuberance. The question, Archie, is whether she knows." It was one of those rare mornings when the brownstone's comfort felt smaller than the problem it contained. Wolfe poured himself another beer and went at it the way a surgeon handles a difficult organ. "We are forced," he said, "to admit that our charming client may be an imposter. Not necessarily by her own design, yet an imposter nonetheless. I tried for levity, because someone had to. That'll look good on the invoice. Professional advice rendered to possible counterfeit person." He ignored that. "The logic is inevitable. If the true child perished and the estate persisted, someone substituted another. They did not build a fortune. They constructed a forgery." I said I'd prefer coffee to metaphysics, but he waved a hand. "No, Archie. We shall have both. Bring the letters again." He reread a paragraph, muttering about handwriting pressure and emotional restraint. I watched him and wondered, not for the first time, how a man could look so pleased while dismantling someone's life. After the second beer and the third deduction, he gave his verdict. "Albert Vale, the uncle. He will know the anatomy of the fraud, or the poisoner's recipe for silence." I reached for the phone. "Want me to call him direct?" "Yes. Tell him Nero Wolfe requests a brief conversation regarding the late Lawrence Vale's affairs. And if he says he's busy, he will not. Men who are guilty of precision are never too busy to rehearse it again." Albert Vale's townhouse on East 74th was the kind of place that looked honest from the curb and smelled dishonest once you stepped in. He greeted me like a man trained by diplomats, smile exact, handshake dry, words oiled. "Ah, Mr. Goodwin. My niece told me to expect you. Terrible business, this blackmail nonsense. How may I assist?" It wasn't a question, it was a performance cue. I took out my notebook and gave him the look that usually makes people start filling it. "Just routine," I said. "We're checking some old family records. Your brother's papers specifically. You were close, I take it?" "Intimately," he replied with a sigh rehearsed for effect. Lawrence was brilliance incarnate. His success was legendary. "Especially his financial leap in 21, I said. "The one that made the Vale fortune." His smile tightened. "Yes, that was a fortunate windfall. Though not, as rumour insists, by trickery. He talked smoothly, too smoothly, sliding around every question, like it was greased. When I brought up the letters, his fingers tapped the desk once, lightly, then stopped. My sister-in-law was unstable, he said. She wrote many distressing fancies after the child's illness, but surely we needn't exhume family grief. Surely not, I said, and put my notebook away. But he had already told me what I needed. A man too eager to explain innocence is a man whose conscience has developed calluses. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting. Well? He asked. He's polished like a mirror, I said. So polished I can't see what's behind him. Wolfe nodded, eyes heavy-lidded. Yes, deception thrives in light as well as shadow. It multiplies like ivy, strangling truth and host alike. He shut his eyes and sipped. Archie, deceit is never solitary. When one lie flowers, it needs others to bear fruit. Margaret arrived that evening, polished as ever. I told her Wolfe wanted to see her privately. When she entered the office, he spoke without rising. Miss Vale, what would you say if I suggested your inheritance is founded on another child's death? Her colour drained, but she didn't collapse. I'd say you were cruel, Mr. Wolfe. Cruelty, madam, is the price of precision. She tried a faint smile. You think I'm not who I claim to be? He closed his eyes. I think the truth frightens you less than the discovery. After she left the room, I followed her to the hall. She turned suddenly, the poise cracking like old china. Mr. Goodwin, I never meant harm. I only wanted what was promised to me. I didn't ask for the lie. I inherited it. I might have believed her until I saw Wolfe standing in the doorway, silent, having heard every word. His face was unreadable. When she was gone, he turned back toward his desk, muttering like a man sealing a tomb. They built their fortune upon a ghost, he said, and now the ghost demands payment. He rang for Fritz to bring dinner, signalling that the moral funeral was concluded. But I could tell from the way his eyes stayed half open, staring at nothing, that the case had grown teeth, and it wasn't done biting yet. When Wolfe decides a case has turned unclean, he withdraws from it like a cat from cold water. That morning, he sat behind his desk, jaw set, eyes closed, his fingers steepled like they were holding up a cathedral of disgust. The police, he announced, have fouled the air beyond tolerance. Miss Vale is detained, and Inspector Kramer, in his barbarous zeal, will trample what little evidence remains unspoiled. We will not meddle further. The case is contaminated by sentiment. I asked if he meant their sentiment or ours. Both, he said. Yours in particular. That last part landed where he wanted it to. Wolfe knows how to plant a word like a seed and wait for it to grow thorns. I told him he could call me sentimental when he saw me writing poetry. He replied, I have no wish to witness catastrophe in rhyme. Then he closed his eyes, effectively dismissing me. I didn't argue. Out loud anyway. But if there's one thing that gets under my skin faster than Kramer's voice, it's watching a woman go down for something she didn't do while Wolfe sits serenely polishing his conscience. He calls it restraint. I call it paralysis, with good diction. So when I put on my hat and stepped out that afternoon, I didn't tell Fritz where I was going. Fritz, being no fool, didn't ask. The papers were full of it. Heiress behind bars. Blackmail murder tied to poison plot. New York likes its morals simple and its suspects decorative. Half the city thought she'd done it because she was rich, the other half because she was beautiful. Somewhere in between was the truth, and I was in the mood to shake its hand. The cab driver, catching sight of the headline I'd folded under my arm, said, "That's the blonde, right? I'd fry her for free." I told him to mind the light, not the law. At the women's detention centre, Margaret Vale wasn't the polished heiress who had walked into our office with a trembling smile. She looked smaller, stripped of her armour of fur and perfume. The guard led me in, and she lifted her head slowly, like she was remembering how. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, her voice low but steady. Mr. Wolfe sent you. I shook my head. This is a solo number. Wolfe doesn't do jail decor. That got a faint smile, the kind that hurts more than tears. They think I killed her, she said. They look at me like a story they've already finished reading. I told her to start a new one, and she did. I was adopted, she said suddenly, the words coming out too fast. My father, Lawrence Vale, wasn't my father. He took me in secretly after his own daughter died. Only my uncle and Leona Farr knew. She threatened to tell. That's what the blackmail was. I asked her why she hadn't said so before. Because I didn't want to lose my name, she whispered. It was all I ever really owned. She looked up at me, pale but defiant. I didn't kill her, Mr. Goodwin. I swear it. She was alive when I left her apartment. She laughed at me, said truth could ruin me faster than poison. Her hands twisted together. Whoever killed her knew about my adoption, and they used it. I was the easiest target. I watched her for a minute, trying to find the lie. There wasn't one. There was only fear wrapped in pride. All right, I said. Don't talk to anyone else. Not Kramer, not the press. I'll handle it. Her eyes softened, but she didn't thank me. Maybe she knew better than to believe promises made in a jail cell. Outside, I stood on the steps a while, letting the wind do its work. Wolfe would call what I'd done insubordination. I called it decency. The trouble is, in our line of work, those two words don't get along. Still, I knew one thing. She wasn't the killer, and I wasn't going to let Wolfe's disgust stop me from proving it. When I got back to the brownstone, Fritz was setting the table for dinner, and Wolfe was in his chair, looking at me as though he'd been timing the distance between guilt and arrival. You've been out, he said. Just walking, I told him. Clears the mind. Your mind, he said, is not a window to be aired at whim. He went back to his book, but his eyes stayed on me a second too long. I could feel his curiosity like static in the air, but he didn't ask. He didn't have to. Wolfe has a way of smelling disobedience the way a hound smells bacon. Finally, he muttered, compassion, in a detective, is a disease of the will. It clouds judgment and invites ruin. I said, I'll try not to sneeze. He sighed, the kind of sigh that means I'm a hopeless case, and reached for his beer. The office went quiet, except for the sound of him sipping and me pretending to type. But under the hum of the brownstone's piece, something had shifted. Wolfe knew I'd crossed the line he drew, and I knew he'd let me, for now. Because somewhere behind all that formal logic and disdain for sentiment, Nero Wolfe wanted the truth just as badly as I did. He just preferred not to get his hands dirty finding it. It started with a scrap of paper no bigger than a man's palm, the kind of thing most people would use to light a cigarette and forget. Wolfe didn't. He had it laid out on a blotter under his magnifier as though it were the Rosetta Stone. The torn edge showed half a postmark, Bergen, and the faint corner of a green 1-cent stamp. Wolfe's forefinger rested beside it, fat and deliberate. Bergenfield, New Jersey, he said. The hand that mailed Miss Vale's blackmail letters used stationery of this stock, and the pressure marks suggest repetition. The writer was prolific. Or cheap, I said. Postage adds up. He gave me the look reserved for insects. You will go to Bergenfield. Trace the post office clerk who cancelled this stamp. Sure, I said. A scenic junket to the suburbs. Bah! It is an errand of consequence. He handed me the fragment with the air of a man donating art to an unworthy museum. I pocketed it and went out, wondering if truth always began this small and this grubby. Bergenfield was the kind of place that gets written about in advertisements for soap, all clapboard houses and curtains stiff with starch. The main street had a movie theatre, a bank, and 3 women who managed to notice me before I reached the post office door. I wasn't expecting excitement, and I got what I expected. The town smelled of clean sidewalks and hidden gossip. like a community built on the belief that scandal only happens to people with different zip codes. The post office clerk was the kind of man who could remember what you ordered for breakfast 3 years ago, especially if you hadn't paid yet. He squinted at the envelope fragment, then nodded. Yeah, sure. Seen that handwriting. Fellow sent half a dozen like it. Nervous type, always checking if the mail would go out on time. Name? He frowned in concentration, tapping his forehead. Darnell. Philip Darnell. Had a look about him. Educated. Maybe used to something better than Bergenfield. He's still around? Apartment house down on Whitestone Avenue, 2nd floor left. If you find him, tell him I said he still owes me 30 cents postage. I thanked him, left him his 30 cents, and went to find the man who'd turned ink into leverage. Philip Darnell's name had a familiar ring. It took a few blocks of walking to remember where I'd heard it before. He'd been Margaret Vale's fiancé once, back when the Vale fortune was still shiny, and he was a rising broker on his way to Fifth Avenue respectability. Then came the whisper of scandal, a broken engagement, and a man who vanished from the society pages like yesterday's headline. The kind of man who might start mailing blackmail letters to the woman who'd left him holding an empty future. The door to his flat opened after the second knock. Darnell looked like life had been chewing on him, and hadn't decided whether to finish. He invited me in, eyes darting like he expected the furniture to testify against him. I know who you are, he said before I'd spoken. Wolfe's errand boy. She sent you, didn't she? She hired us, I corrected. You sent the letters. He rubbed his face. I needed money. I didn't think she'd go to the police. I swear, I didn't touch that woman, Leona Farr. She was alive when I left her. Why go to her? She knew about Margaret's secret, the adoption. She promised to keep quiet if I paid her share. Then she started threatening me too. He leaned forward suddenly, desperate, his voice trembling. But you want the truth, don't you? I'll tell you who really wanted Leona dead. The person... He froze. Something outside the window cracked like a board snapping in winter. I moved, but too late. The shot punched through the glass and buried itself in the wall. Darnell hit the floor, cursing, more from shock than pain. I dragged him behind the table. Another bullet tore into the window frame. Whoever was, out there wasn't interested in warning shots. I yanked my revolver free, but all I caught was a blur moving away through the drizzle beyond the alley fence. By the time I reached the street, the blur had turned into nothing. It took a few minutes to get my breath and my heartbeat back where they belonged. Darnell, white-faced, was sitting on the floor when I returned. You see? He whispered. They'll kill anyone who gets close. Yeah, I said. But next time, let's arrange it so they miss by a wider margin. By the time I left Bergenfield, rain was turning the streets into black glass. I took a shortcut through the alley beside the post office, and that's when I heard the echo of shoes behind me. I went left, then right. The steps followed. I sprinted through a maze of wet trash cans and backyards, ducking behind a fence as a figure passed close enough to touch. Then the footsteps faded, leaving only the rain. I decided the Bergenfield night had offered enough exercise for one day and made for the station. Back at the brownstone, Fritz patched a cut over my eyebrow while Wolfe sat behind his desk, half disapproving, half pleased to have something to frown about. You indulge in too much gallantry, he said. An investigator who attracts gunfire has lost proportion. Proportion? I said. If I'd been an inch taller, I'd have lost a lot more than that. He grunted. You obtained results, at least. I gave him the details, Darnell's confession, the attempt on our lives, and the sense that someone in the Vale family tree was pruning branches the hard way. Wolfe listened without interruption, tapping a finger on his chair arm. When I finished, he leaned back. Commendation for excessive impudence, he said. But the lead is sound. The web is contracting. He closed his eyes, thinking. Darnell's knowledge of the adoption connects him to Miss Vale, and Leona's death links them all. Whoever orchestrated the deception 30 years ago now removes the witnesses. The killer is not improvising, Archie. He is cleaning. Cleaning what? I asked. History, Wolfe said softly. And when one cleans history, one leaves fingerprints on the present. We shall find them. I didn't argue. Wolfe had that look. The one that means he's halfway to the solution and all I have to do is keep up. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone out there was done hiding in the shadows. They were coming closer. And this time, Wolfe's brownstone might not be beyond their reach. Wolfe's silence can fill a house the way music fills a concert hall. Deliberate, complete, and inescapable. He had retreated to his orchid rooms after lunch, leaving me downstairs with nothing but the rustle of the Times and the faint tick of Fritz moving about the kitchen. The afternoon light slanted through the office windows, like it was ashamed to intrude. I tried typing up notes from Bergenfield, but got only as far as Darnell Phillip, scared stiff, but not stiff yet, before quitting. The truth was, Wolfe's silences were contagious. He wasn't just avoiding conversation, he was distilling it. Up there among his tropical beauties, the man thought better than most people pray. I gave it an hour before I started pacing, and another before I gave up pretending I wasn't waiting for the sound of his elevator. It came at last, slow, groaning, ceremonial. Wolfe emerged, looking like a mountain that had decided to move for its own amusement. He didn't glance my way as he crossed to his desk, settled in, and poured himself beer number 1. Then, in that voice that made philosophy sound like a summons to court, he said, "Archie, it is remarkable how lies resemble orchids." That was the starting gun for the lecture. He leaned back, eyes half closed. Falsehood, like any organic growth, has varieties. There are lies of concealment, mild and defensive, lies of protection, understandable but perilous, and lies of corruption, pernicious, because they deny not merely truth, but order. I asked whether we were still talking about flowers or women. He ignored that. The first may preserve a life, the second may spare a heart, but the third poisons both the teller and the told. I stretched in my chair. You forgot one kind. The lie that keeps people from getting killed, like telling a guy with a gun that you don't know where his target went. He turned his head, amused despite himself. That, Archie, is not a lie. It is a tactical postponement of candor. Sounds like what I tell the taxman. Wolfe's lips twitched. You, sir, are the argument for moral relativism incarnate. I'll take that as a compliment. It was not intended as one. He reached for the magnifier that had been sitting idle since morning, his attention caught by something beside him on the desk. One of the orchid leaves he had trimmed earlier. He frowned. Fui, observe. The leaf had a faint yellow tinge near the stem and, more curiously, a chemical smell. Sharp, almost metallic. Wolfe held it close, nostrils flaring. This is not decay. It is contamination. From what? Fritz's polish? He shook his head. No, from a toxin. The same scent, Archie, that Inspector Kramer described clinging to Leona Farr's glass. A rare alkaloid compound. Its origin, I suspect, is vegetal. I felt the pulse of the chase coming alive again. You mean? Precisely. His eyes brightened. The poison came from a plant, a South American orchid of the Cattleya venenata species, cultivated by collectors, admired for its deceptive fragrance and its subtle venom. He leaned forward, warming to it. Only a few enthusiasts in the United States possess it. One of them, by unhappy coincidence, is Albert Vale. That name hung in the air like smoke. Wolfe's tone hardened. He who profits from falsity often cultivates beauty to disguise it. I said, You think he killed Leona to cover the adoption fraud? I think, Wolfe replied, that deceit, once rooted, needs pruning, and he pruned too zealously. Something shifted in his face then, that rare moment when satisfaction displaced irritation. His shoulders straightened. The heaviness of reflection became momentum. He rang for Fritz. Bring my necktie, he ordered, And 2 more bottles of Remmers. We are to have company. Turning to me, he added, Archie, summon Miss Vale, Mr. Darnell, Mr. Albert Vale, and Inspector Kramer. This evening, 8 o'clock. All of them. Of course, truth, like contagion, demands exposure. I made the calls while Fritz and Wolfe conducted their private war of logistics. Wolfe instructed him on the arrangement of chairs as if he were planning a military campaign. Kramer nearest the window, he blusters best with air. Darnell to his left, Miss Vale opposite me. Albert Vale between them. The geometry will disarm vanity and provoke conflict. Fritz nodded gravely, though he must have thought we were staging a séance instead of a showdown. When the last detail was in place, Wolfe stood by the orchids, hands clasped behind his back. The room smelled faintly of earth and blossoms, innocence and deceit in equal measure. The lie, gentlemen, he said softly, as if rehearsing, has roots. It blooms. It kills. I stayed quiet. The house had that stillness before a thunderstorm, charged, waiting. Outside, the city dimmed into dusk. Inside, Wolfe's mind was already gathering light. I knew that before the night was over, someone's truth would wither and someone's mask would fall. And if experience had taught me anything, it was this. When Nero Wolfe starts tending to lies, he never stops until they're pulled up by the roots. When Wolfe calls a meeting, it isn't a social event. It's a tribunal dressed up as a tea party. The brownstone had that particular hush that comes before fireworks. Fritz had laid out chairs under Wolfe's direction. Geometry, he called it. And I'd been sent to the doorbell like a maitre d' for murderers. Margaret Vale was the first to arrive, pale and deliberate, wearing the kind of calm that only comes from exhaustion. She sat where Wolfe's gesture placed her, spine straight, eyes lowered. Then came Darnell. Twitchy, collar too tight, carrying the smell of cheap gin and cheaper fear. Albert Vale followed, immaculate as a banker in a confessional. He smiled with the wrong part of his face. Kramer came last, stomping in like he expected to find a circus and was already mad about the price of admission. He threw me a glare and then looked around the room. "Everybody here?" he growled. "Everyone essential," Wolfe said. "Sit, Inspector. I abhor redundancy." The air had texture by then, part tension, part perfume, part cigar smoke. It was Wolfe's favourite kind of audience. Guilty, uneasy, and punctual. Kramer's chair creaked in rhythm with his scowl. "You better have more than riddles, Wolfe. I've got a city desk yelling for results, and you drag me into a parlour lecture." Wolfe raised an eyebrow. "Your city desk, Inspector, yells because it must. I speak because I can." Kramer opened his mouth, but Wolfe's hand lifted, soft but final. "All puzzles, Inspector, conclude where they began. Here, in this room, under my roof. If you find that inconvenient, you are free to bluster outside." Kramer grunted. He stayed put. Wolfe reached for his beer and took one slow, ceremonial sip. Then his gaze passed over the room like a surveyor, marking boundaries. "We begin." He started with the obvious. "Philip Darnell," he said, "your guilt was meant to be convenient. You mailed the blackmail letters, yes, you confessed to that. But blackmailers rarely kill the source of their income. Your cowardice is not admirable, but it is, in this instance, exculpatory." Darnell blinked, caught between relief and insult. Wolfe continued without pause. "Miss Vale, or rather Miss Margaret Lawrence, your so-called falsehood was inheritance, not intention. A child given another's name does not lie. She obeys. Your father's deception was his own, and you have borne the burden of his fraud without understanding it." Wolfe shifted his gaze to Albert Vale, whose fingers tightened on the chair arms. "As for you, sir, your eagerness to assist was the most unhelpful honesty I have ever endured. You rehearsed every answer, anticipating every suspicion except one, that your virtue was too complete." Albert tried a smile. "You flatter me, Mr. Wolfe." "I do not flatter," Wolfe said coldly. I dissect. He turned slightly, addressing the room as if dictating to the air. The adoption papers, the false identity, the inheritance, all crafted by one man with motive, both avaricious and aesthetic. Albert Vale forged his brother's signature to secure control of the Vale fortune and installed an orphan as heir to preserve appearances. When Leona Farr discovered the fraud, he silenced her. Permanently. Kramer slapped the arm of his chair. That's a hell of a claim. It is not a claim, Inspector, Wolfe said evenly. It is a conclusion. Every deceit leaves a pattern, like pollen on a petal, and I assure you, Mr. Vale's hands are dusted with both. Albert's composure cracked at the edges. He started to protest, but Wolfe raised a palm. Enough. The motive is old as greed. The method, poison from a rare orchid he alone cultivated. The opportunity, her trust in him, sealed by a drink. The room went still. The only sound Fritz in the kitchen moving a pan, unaware he'd just missed the most delicate bloom of truth Manhattan had seen that week. Wolfe exhaled, deeply satisfied. There, he said quietly. We have stripped away the leaves. The root, Inspector, is yours to pluck. Kramer stood, already barking for headquarters. Darnell slumped forward, Margaret's eyes filled without spilling, and Wolfe reached, calmly, for his second beer. I leaned against the wall, watching him reclaim serenity as if nothing had happened. And I couldn't help thinking, if there's one man who could make a murderer confess with nothing but grammar and orchids, it's Nero Wolfe. Albert Vale had been quiet too long, and Wolfe doesn't like silence unless it's his own. When he finally turned those heavy-lidded eyes toward the uncle, the air in the room seemed to notice. Mr. Vale, Wolfe began, his tone as mild as a glass of warm milk. You are an industrious man. Industriousness, in moderation, is commendable. In excess, it leads to fabrication. Albert smiled, that smooth banker's smile with just enough charm to pass for innocence. You'll have to explain that one, Mr. Wolfe. I shall, Wolfe said. Your earlier statement to Inspector Kramer was that your brother Lawrence personally signed the adoption papers bringing Margaret into the Vale household. I have compared the signatures from those papers with those on Lawrence's surviving business correspondence. They are not the same hand. Albert's smile stayed, but the corners trembled. Forgery, Mr. Wolfe? That's a very serious— Indeed, Wolfe interrupted. Serious enough to found a fortune upon. The deception was buried comfortably until Miss Farr, through some misplaced diligence, found the original papers. You, sir, have been at war with the truth for 30 years. Darnell shifted in his seat. Margaret's breath caught audibly. Wolfe folded his hands and said softly, And in war, Mr. Vale, casualties accumulate. Kramer opened his mouth, but Wolfe had already lifted a finger. A moment, Inspector. I have not finished. He reached for the leaf sample lying on his desk, the one he had taken from his orchids that morning. The poison used to kill Miss Farr was derived from a South American orchid, Cattleya venenata. The alkaloid compound is virtually unknown outside a handful of private collections. There are perhaps 6 such collections in the country. One is mine. Another— He inclined his head toward Albert. Is yours. Albert's throat bobbed once, the motion small but loud in the stillness. I recall, Wolfe went on, your boasting of a specimen gifted to you by a Peruvian trader, acquired at no small expense. A fine rarity, and deadly if mishandled. The police, I believe, found traces of the same compound on Miss Farr's drinking glass. No apothecary, no chemist, and no layman could have prepared it. Only a collector of orchids would know its potency or its scent. I glanced at Kramer. His jaw had dropped far enough to make a dentist happy. Wolfe ignored him. Your mistake, Mr. Vale, was to treat your collection as both hobby and arsenal. Wolfe's tone had softened almost to regret when he delivered the coup. Leona Farr rediscovered the fraud that made you rich. You paid her once to keep silent. Then, when she realized her leverage had limits, you silenced her. You met her at her apartment, the same evening Miss Vale visited. You shared a drink, poured from a bottle she trusted, and ensured it carried the scent of death and flowers. Albert tried to speak, but it came out as air. The forgery, Wolfe continued, was your first lie, the root. The murder was simply its final bloom. That finished it. The sound of Margaret's muffled sob and Darnell's nervous swallow filled the gap. Kramer leaned forward, every muscle waiting for Wolfe's nod. When Albert finally moved, it wasn't to protest. His voice, when it came, was small, shredded by something that had finally caught up to him. "She wouldn't stop," he whispered. "She said she'd ruin the name, the business, everything. I only wanted her quiet." Wolfe didn't move. He simply inclined his head toward Kramer. "Inspector, the door." Kramer signaled, and the officers outside entered. They didn't need to be told whom to take. Albert Vale didn't resist. As they led him out, he turned once toward Margaret, as though looking for sympathy. He didn't find any. The door closed softly, leaving a vacuum where deceit had stood. Wolfe stared at the empty chair for a long moment. Then he reached for his beer, turning it slowly between his hands. "Truth, once counterfeited," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "demands fresh forgeries to survive. Each fabrication must be sustained by another until the weight of deception crushes its author. Lies are not tools, Archie. They are infections." Margaret sat very still, eyes fixed on the carpet. "Am I part of that infection, Mr. Wolfe?" He shook his head once. "No, madam. You are merely the residue. The act was your father's, perpetuated by your uncle, and purified, regrettably, by murder." She rose quietly, and Fritz, who had been waiting in the doorway, guided her toward the hall. Kramer let out a long breath that probably had been stored since the beginning of the meeting. "You know, Wolfe," he said, "someday your luck's gonna run out. You can't keep pulling miracles out of beer foam." "Luck," Wolfe replied, "is a word coined by the indolent to explain the industry of others." Kramer made a sound that could have been a snort or a surrender. He barked a few orders to his men, then left, muttering about paperwork. When the last footstep faded, I went to the cabinet, pulled out 2 bottles, and handed one across the desk. Wolfe's eyes were closed, the corners of his mouth relaxed into something that might, in a generous mood, be called satisfaction. "Well," I said, taking a seat, "that wraps it. 1 forgery, 1 murder, and a small philosophical sermon. Business as usual." He took a slow sip. "Indeed. I dislike murder, but I loathe disorder more." We drank in silence. The orchids overhead glowed faintly in the lamplight, and for a while the only sound in the room was Wolfe's quiet, contented sigh. The sound of intellect at rest after a full meal of truth. The brownstone had its morning silence back, the kind that settles over the place after Wolfe has demolished another human illusion. Fritz's coffee smelled stronger than usual, maybe because it was competing with the ghost of last night's excitement. The paper lay unopened on Wolfe's desk. The orchids above us glistened with mist, and I could almost hear the city pretending not to have seen a murder solved. Wolfe was in his chair, slippers back on duty, hands folded across the equator of his stomach. His eyelids were lowered just enough to suggest meditation, or digestion. I couldn't tell which. I sat across from him with a cup of my own and tried to decide whether I felt satisfied or just tired. Justice, it turns out, doesn't come with much applause. Only quiet, coffee, and the faint click of a typewriter that isn't being used. That was the mood when the bell rang. Margaret Vale, or whatever name she was going to use now, stood in the doorway like someone freshly unburdened. She looked lighter, even in black. Fritz ushered her in, and she thanked him with the kind of smile that makes gratitude sound expensive. Wolfe inclined his head an inch. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "I wanted to thank you. I'm leaving New York tonight. I've decided to use my birth name, Margaret Lawrence. It's time I stopped borrowing one that wasn't mine. Wolfe nodded once, gravely. A sensible resolution. Names, Miss Lawrence, like fortunes, are best earned, not inherited under false pretense. She looked at him, then at me. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget any of this. You shouldn't, Wolfe said. Memory is the tax conscience levies on folly. When she left, the room felt emptier than it had any right to. The next knock wasn't polite. It was Kramer's. He came in with his hat in one hand and irritation in the other. All right, Wolfe, he said. You did it again. Don't ask me how and don't expect me to like it. Wolfe looked up mildly. Your approval, Inspector, is neither requested nor required. Kramer scowled, but there was a ghost of respect under the gravel. Still, credit where it's due. You made my men look like they were chasing butterflies. One of these days, though, your luck's going to turn. Luck, Wolfe murmured, is a superstition born of laziness and fear. I prefer method. Kramer grunted. You're still a pain in the department's neck. Then I shall endeavour, Wolfe said, to remain consistent. He gestured toward Fritz, who appeared as if summoned by grammar. Beer, Wolfe said. 2 bottles. Intellect, unlike champagne, requires quiet carbonation. Kramer rolled his eyes. I poured myself a glass. After the inspector left, Wolfe leaned back and sighed, the satisfied kind, not the tired one. I decided it was time to lighten the air. You know, I said, we should bill Miss Lawrence, for moral restoration. It's rarer than murder these days. Wolfe's eyebrows twitched. Archie, righteousness is not a commodity. No, but it rents well. He gave me the look reserved for insolence, just clever enough to be tolerated. Payment, Archie, is a vulgar necessity. The mind's satisfaction suffices. I grinned. I'll remember that when Fritz asks about the butcher's bill. Fritz, Wolfe said without looking up, never asks. He merely presents. And right on cue, Fritz entered, rolling in lunch with the solemnity of a coronation. He served the plates in silence, then waited, hands folded, for approval. Wolfe tasted, nodded, and resumed serenity. As for me, I leaned back and announced, Truth may set you free, but it won't keep Fritz in veal cutlets. Fritz chuckled, which for him is practically applause. Wolfe gave me half a glare, which, from him, is affection. Lunch proceeded with the familiar comfort of routine rediscovered. Wolfe ate with his usual reverence, I with my usual appetite. When it was over, I leaned against the desk and looked around the room. Same orchids, same chair, same man brooding over the eternal stupidity of mankind. Another murder solved, another liar unmasked, another check probably lost to principal. Wolfe reached for his beer, eyes half closed. The orchids above him seemed to listen, and that was that. West 35th Street had gone back to normal, or whatever passes for it when you share a house with the fattest, laziest, and sharpest brain in New York. In the quiet that follows justice, truth rarely feels triumphant. It simply sits, unadorned, waiting to be believed. Lies may glitter brighter, but they burn faster, leaving behind only the ash of what people once pretended to be. Wolfe would call it order restored. I might call it another illusion tidied up before lunch. But tell me, when a lie is born from love or fear, is it still a crime, or just another form of survival? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.